Bienvenidos. Welcome to Centro's event, Meet the Authors, with Federico Subervi-Vélez, Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, and Jairo Lugo-Ocando, talking about their new book, The News Media in Puerto Rico, Journalism in Colonial Settings and in Times of Crisis. In tonight's program, the authors will make a presentation of their book in two parts, followed by a brief commentary by Dr. Carlos Vargas Ramos. At the end of the second presentation, we will have a Q&A with the audience. Please send your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to introduce tonight's commentator, Dr. Carlos Vargas Ramos, who is the Director for Public Policy, External and Media Relations, and Development at Centro. As a social scientist, he has worked on the impact of migration on Puerto Rican political behavior, attitudes, and orientations, as well on issues of racial identity. A political scientist by training, Dr. Vargas Ramos is editor of the book Race Front and Center, Puerto Rican Perspectives on Race, and co-editor of Puerto Ricans at the Dawn of the New Millennium. Please help me welcome Dr. Carlos Vargas Ramos.
Thank you very much, Lily. Buenas tardes, good evening to one and all who have joined us today for this virtual event, this Meet the Author event. For me, it is a pleasure to welcome and share the virtual stage with these esteemed colleagues as they present a very important work, the news media in Puerto Rico, journalism in colonial settings and in times of crisis. There is no doubt in my mind that this was not only a labor of love, but also a work of intense reflection, and I would not be surprised if it was also the case, tears. Conditions in Puerto Rico at the turn of the new century and millennium have been inauspicious for its people, and the account that Federico Subervi-Vélez, Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, and Jairo Lugo-Ocando provide makes it plain that this is also the case for the news media in Puerto Rico. The news media in Puerto Rico, journalism in colonial settings and in time of crisis, is a serious academic work from respected academics and practitioners. Dr. Federico Subervi-Vélez is Honorary Associate Fellow of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies programs at the University of Wisconsin. A resident of Texas, he is working on the development of Boricua, a startup radio and multi-platform information, entertainment, and news organization for the Puerto Rican diaspora and other Latino communities in Florida. He is author and editor of The Mass Media and Latino Politics, Studies in U.S. Media Content, Campaign Strategies and Survey Research, 1994-2004, and he is co-editing the Primera Antología de Comunicación Política de Puerto Rico. He is also co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Race, Ethnicity, and Communication. Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto is an award-winning investigative journalist with experience reporting in Puerto Rico, the United States, and Latin America. She is also a news and political analyst, a radio commentator, a television producer, columnist, and blogger. She hosts a daily radio program and a weekend online show, both on investigative reporting and news analysis. Author of several books on communication and journalism, including the collection of essays and columns En Blanco y Negro con Sandra, Frente a los Medios, Bitácora de una Transmisión Radial, all about her work on the only radio network that remained on air during and after Hurricane Maria in 2017. And of course, she is now co-author of the news media in Puerto Rico, journalism in colonial settings and in terms of crisis. Dr. Jairo Lugo-Ocando is professor in residence of Northwestern University, Qatar campus. He is author of more than a dozen books and over 50 peer-reviewed journal articles. Over the years, he has received in excess of $1 million in external research grants, funding a variety of national of research provided by national and international agencies. Before becoming an academic, he worked as a journalist, correspondent, and news editor for several media outlets, in Latin America. Together, they wrote The News Media in Puerto Rico, Journalism in Colonial Settings, and in Times of Crises, which is a 198-page, three-part book um, published this year by Routledge. And I understand that the Spanish version of the book is forthcoming. The book's three parts are divided into 8 chapters. Chapter 1 provides a broad contextual introduction to the subject matter of the book that provides the motivation for its content and the efforts undertaken by the authors. Chapter 2, a discussion of the factors that shape how the media in Puerto Rico operates, specifically the broader context of Puerto Rico's colonial relation with the United States and its structural and institutional effects on media and journalistic practices there. Chapters 3, 4, and 5, and 6, the last 3 of which constitute part 2 of the book, capture the description of the media landscape in Puerto Rico, with the disaster wrought by Hurricane Maria serving as an inflection point. With this landmark in mind, the authors divide the media before Maria in chapter 3 and after Maria in chapter 4, comparing and contrasting conditions on the island media before and after the cyclone in detail. Chapter 5 provides the findings of a survey of Puerto Rican journalists, offering a first-hand account on conditions in the profession from those who practice it. Chapter 6 provides a description of the educational system that prepares journalists to practice the profession, as well as recommendations on how to improve it based on the opinions provided by practicing journalists in the survey described in Chapter 5. Chapter 7 and 8 form the third part of the book, with Chapter 7 offering a theoretical framework for the comparative analysis of the media in colonial settings, while Chapter 8 offers areas of future research about the media in Puerto Rico and other colonial settings. The themes around the role of colonialism and in shaping the environment journalism is practicing in Puerto Rico, the political economy of the media business, the erosion of credibility of institutions on the island, particularly its government, as a result of lack of transparency in government operations given by limited access to public information and the manipulation of the information that is released, and the cozy and even incestuous relations that exist between government officials and former officials operating under the guise of media figures, and journalists all play leading roles in explaining the media landscape in Puerto Rico. The chapters on areas for further research is telling precisely because there is a great need for additional research in the areas of cyber propaganda, government communication apparatus, with an emphasis on the manipulation and control of knowledge, quantitative and survey-based research on political communication, and on the practice and culture of journalism as a profession, as well as, for further research, the role of the diaspora in this entire landscape. Perhaps unexpected is the degree of optimism evident, nevertheless, among the practicing journalists who participated in the survey the authors conducted, given the great obstacles to practicing ethical journalism in Puerto Rico. In light of all the adversity visited upon this profession, it is actually inspiring to see that there is yet hope among these professionals. The news media in Puerto Rico, journalism in colonial settings and in times of crisis, is timely. Not only does it serve to fill a huge void of knowledge about the practice of journalism and conditions around the news media in Puerto Rico, it is prescriptive in how to improve what afflicts the media landscape in the country. These prescriptions come not simply out of the author's own insights, but specifically based on the empirical findings and voices of practicing authors and retired journalists in Puerto Rico, an approach that gives it heft to the volume in general. It is a great addition to the scholarly literature in Puerto Rico, and the professional practice of journalists. And I congratulate you all for this tremendous work. I will also address the members of the audience and invite them to engage these authors as they tell us about this terrific contribution to the literature. And I want to mention and reiterate the point that Lily Santiago made at the outset, that even though we have a chat feature, if you want to engage and ask questions of the authors, to please use the Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They'll be happy to respond to whatever questions you may have or whatever reactions you may have about the subject, which we will be taking them all as the event progresses. But what I would like now to do is welcome our authors, Federico Subervi-Vélez, Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, and Jairo Lugo-Ocando, who will be providing us with an explanation and further details of their terrific book.
Thank you all for participating and being here to listen to this webinar. We're delighted to share with you some of the highlights of a book that came together thanks to three minds who had similar interest in journalism and colonial settings: Federico Subervi-Vélez, Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, and Jairo Lugo-Ocando. We're reaching you today from Austin, Texas, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Qatar. These three people came together because I had an interest in developing another study that had been started many years ago about the structure and the history of the media in Puerto Rico. Luckily, I came to meet Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, who's the person who's probably the most knowledgeable of the daily occurrences of the media in Puerto Rico. And she's been writing about this for many years. And then I had the fortune to have met and mingled with Jairo Lugo-Ocando at the University of Sheffield University, and then at the University of Leeds, where I eventually got invited to spend a year writing this book, which was a long process, but it finally came together thanks to other people who also contributed some ideas, like Jay Blumler, rest in peace, who was instrumental in getting us to not just to write a chapter and an essay, but to make it into a book. And this book has one particular purpose, first of all, to document the current situation of the media system of Puerto Rico, its foundations, how it works, why it works as it does, to document the developments of the media after the Hurricane Maria and how people struggle there, and also to share with the audience and the readers the views from the journalists who worked there. That was something that came about because as I was wrapping up my writing of the book with the help of Sandra, my dear friend Jairo said, well, why don't you go to Puerto Rico and interview some journalists there and get their views? And that came out to be not just a dozen journalists, as he had said, just talk to the most prominent dozen journalists. Well, we ended up talking to, by email, phone, and interpersonal conversations, with 60 journalists who gave us their views about the current situation of the media, how it works and why it doesn't work, and their challenges. And also they gave us some views about journalism education, which we highlight in the book. And of course, this has to have some theoretical foundations, which it does with the colonial settings. Jairo is an expert in that for not only Latin America, but world journalism issues. And here we are. We put together these thoughts, these ideas, and we ended up with the book with a final chapter on recommendations for future research, what we'd like to see done, which is then again the second major goal of the book. The first one being the documentation, the second one to serve as an incentive for developing journalism, communication research in Puerto Rico. Here I should add that the book is being translated right now as we speak. It's under process. And I have the good news that we might have an editor from Puerto Rico, a publishing house in Puerto Rico, which I'll share with my colleagues afterwards, but it's not in writing yet, so I can't tell you which one it is. but it is in process, and we will have a publisher to have this book in Espanol, hopefully by early next year. With that, I'd like to have some views from Sandra, who was so instrumental in writing about and keeping abreast about the current developments of the media in Puerto Rico. She still does, and that's her column. That's her En Blanco y Negro con Sandra, and then also from Jairo, who will be talking to us about this. Now, just a brief from them, and then we'll get into some other details about the book. Sandra, thank you so much for being here, for being part of this effort.
Thank you, Federico. Hola, Jairo, and everybody tuning into this webinar. As Federico said, I've been writing about the media in Puerto Rico for over 25 years, and seeing all the transformations and all the changes within the industry, and that coincided with the advent of the digital world. As in any other places in the rest of the planet, there has been many changes and challenges as well in the profession. But in Puerto Rico, you have to add the colonial settings where we are, the fact that most of the media are not locally owned, are owned by companies in the United States, and that also entails some interest within the topics that are covered and the focus on the media in Puerto Rico. And on the other hand, we also have to take into account all the transformations that have occurred in the past few years, particularly since Hurricanes Irma and Maria that basically destroyed all the media on the island. During Hurricane Maria in 2017, all the television stations went off. We didn't have internet for many weeks and even months in some areas of the island. The island was without any power grid. It was completely destroyed. And even though we have about 124, it all depends on the time you're looking up for the specific amount of radio stations, but we do have, or we were considered in Puerto Rico, the US territory with the largest amount of radio stations per square mile. And most of the stations went off after the hurricane. Only one radio network remained on the air. It was Wapa Radio, and I happened to be there as a volunteer for 4 months. We call on about 70, we just mentioned some of the reporters who wanted to show up after the hurricane, and about 70 journalists showed up. And we also, covering the aftermath of that disaster, we found out that some of the newsrooms were completely destroyed. So it took some time into going back to normal after that. So we include that on the book. We also include there the advent and the increase in new technologies such as blogging and digital era, and also the podcast, which is a segment that is really increasing in the last few years in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. And I also like to point out that particularly we include in the book what happened during the summer of 2019, which was a result of some of the things that we were, and particularly myself was after that, because I was seeing some trends in basically controlling what the media was able to say. Also the campaigns, political campaigns that were geared towards limiting the freedom of the press, attacking journalists, and also going after basically opposing subjects, destroying reputations of journalists online harassment, and all that, being unfortunately sometimes a victim of that as well. I've been documented that for the past few years, and that ended up during the summer of 2019 when we were able to publish the first few pages also of the infamous Telegram chat that involved the former governor, Ricardo Rosselló, and some of his aides. When we covered that, when I printed the first 10 or 12 pages of the chat, and then the second article that I wrote about it, basically all the online harassment stopped. And that's when every theory or hypothesis that I had, and I discussed with Federico, also with Jairo and other experts on the field, that there was something going on the media in Puerto Rico, and that it had to do with the colonial settings that we're in. The fact that there was something going on in terms of manipulating the press and in propaganda, political propaganda. And you can see that happening right after the summer of 2019. So afterwards, we've been, recovering from that. And right now we're still dealing with some of the backlash from that situation, also from the situation of what happened during the hurricane, and most recently the earthquake, and now the pandemic. So we have been under a lot of.
We'll be covering an update. Yeah, we'll be having an update for the Spanish version. We'll be having an update that will include the developments given the pandemic.
Exactly. So and I do think there has been some articles and books written about Puerto Rico, but this is the first time I see something that is so comprehensive of everything that is going on, given the fact that it's, and also looking at it through the lenses of the colonial settings that we're in. And with that, I think Jairo could add some theoretical aspects in that regard. Jairo.
Yeah, well, as I think that I'm going to start by thanking my co-authors, both Federico and Sandra, because for me it was an interesting but also enriching experience. I think what we developed here was a truly ethnographic understanding of Puerto Rico, of Puerto Rican society through its media, because that's really what we did. And what we did is try to understand all this tangible and intangible hegemonic mechanism that are constantly used to perpetuate the colonial settings that dominates the politics of Puerto Rico. And to me, when we came to the project, which was, I met Federico some years ago, and I said, to Federico, why don't we put some grant? And it was the Leverhulme grant. We got the grant, and that allowed the initial conversation. Then he introduced Sandra, and we came together, and we started talking about that. And to me, this really surprising thing is how little literature there was about Puerto Rico. How little there was really understanding of what it is, and the initial conversation
of the media of Puerto Rico, because there's a lot of writing about Puerto Rico and it's colonial, but not on the media, from the media perspective, precisely.
Sorry for that. Yeah, so on the media of Puerto Rico, and when I talked to other media scholars in Europe about Puerto Rico, I was in Europe at that time, and they were like, well, but Puerto Rico is not I mean, they didn't really even understand. Puerto Rico is one of these colonies that passes under the radar because it's assumed that there's a level of equality and that the people are treated with equality and that the society is treated with equality. And that's not the case. That is absolutely not the case. So one of the things that I think that we do in the book very well is to contextualize the debates about the media in the context, sorry for repeating, but in the context of the colonial and post-colonial settings. And this is a very important thing. I mean, we draw from Edward Said and other theorists about Fanon, but it's beyond this criticism and beyond the fact that we still have to talk in the 21st century about colonialism. I felt that it's a very fresh book. It's very new. The newness that tells us, that also there's this resistance, that there's this movement that is not a passive society that is just taking it. It's also a society that is, and through its media, it's responding. And I mean, Sandra was mentioning the former governor of Puerto Rico, who was outside of power because of people like Sandra and other journalists, because of their tireless work. And actually, today we see the current politician, the current governor, also trying to move against the people looking for having different ways of thinking. So I enjoy highly the fact that the type of discussions that we offer here were the type of discussions that are just contextualized in a longer and larger debate around colonial and post-colonial settings, but that at the same time it was very fresh because we had the opportunity to explore and analyze what is actually happening today. And I think the opportunity to analyze the media in the period, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, was an outstanding opportunity, because as we write in the book, the hurricane not only uprooted physical trees, but uprooted the layers of lies and deceit about what Puerto Rico really is in the eyes of the United States. And I think that was the main contribution, I think, that we did in the book.
In the second half, we will be addressing some key points from the structure of the media in Puerto Rico, and also some key points of the findings from the views from the journalist. And we will also mention some research ideas that we would be delighted to have others follow for future research in this arena that has still not been addressed as it merits in a colonial setting in Puerto Rico. We'll take a pause, have the questions, and continue.
Federico, Jairo, Sandra, again, congratulations on a terrific volume. I enjoy reading it very much. It is definitely going to serve as, reference when it comes to media studies in Puerto Rico, but not just media studies, relations between the government and its people, perhaps mediated through the media, etc. So in order to get us started in the conversation, I just wanted to share with you a thought that I had as I was reading. This thought kept coming up as I went through the book, and it is the struggle that exists for readers and viewers of the different media, in regards to the increasing proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, that the public in general is exposed to. You have referred to this as the tsunami of cyber propaganda. And while you also acknowledge that this was not necessarily a topic you address in this book at the moment, you nevertheless highlight that it is the most imperative subject in the agenda for future research. So, and related to this subject is the concern with the erosion of credibility of trusted institutions, particularly media entities in Puerto Rico. So with this in mind, would you please comment or offer some insights into how a conscientious reader or viewer discern the validity and reliability of media content that they are exposed to?
Two things. Number one, it takes an educated, not necessarily college educated, but just an educated reader to do his or her part on checking sources, and if nothing else, not liking and passing forward information, news that seem beyond pale to be true. That's the first part. And number two, in the chat, you may soon be seen, and we'll be providing a series of sources, a number of sources for fact checking, and there are a lot, and that's just una muestra. That's just a few of the many ways that, when in doubt, question, search, do background before you take the alarmist view and the propaganda view and pass it forward to others who may not be as informed or as smart as you are to check these things. So do the homework. And since we're not going to see the media corporations changing in the short term, I don't see that happening, but the public can change. And that's why the imperative is on news and media literacy, and that's part of what the book addresses as well.
Mm-hmm. Sandra, Jairo?
Well, I'd like to add that, yes, as Federico mentioned, any individual must do some sort of fact check. But I'm optimistic, being a journalist, and basically because of the advent of all the new technologies, social media, and all the competitiveness, even though there's a lot of noise, people can also have access to accurate sources, to serious journalists, and to serious reporting, where they can double check and go back and forth and basically verify the information, which is the most important thing that at this moment is somewhere lacking. And I do feel optimistic about that.
Mhm, mhm. Jairo.
Yeah, I think that, of course, we are facing globally a crisis for, particularly for journalism, because of the fundamental changes in the media landscape. We have now an audiences which is highly fragmented, and also, you know, the proliferation of new technologies that allows any type of people. I mean, you know, it's in the U.S. at the moment. It's crazy with all these like really right-wing media outlets that spreads lies and, you know, without control or anything. So I think I go back to what Federico was saying earlier about the need to work more closely with the education system to make sure that citizens are engaged in longitudinal terms with the understanding of their own society. I mean, I think what they're doing, for example, in Finland, which is creating a very close connection between the news media and the schools to make sure that children are socialized in reading news from a very early age, is a very important thing, not only for this generation, but for future generations. I mean, we have had, of course, fake news ever. I mean, it's not new for humanity. I mean, you can trace it back to the Roman times, and where fake news was dispersed and disseminated to, you know, to confuse the enemies. You can go back to the Persians and you'll find that. But what it is new now is that we have this technological problem, and I'm not being techno-deterministic, but we have to recognize that the technological platforms that we have nowadays, in which anybody can create channels and communicate, it creates real havoc in across people. And of course, over the years, the mainstream corporate media have made serious mistake. For example, in the war in Iraq in 2003, where a lot of the credibility of this media was lost in the eyes of the public. The answer to that, in my view, is to have very good journalism, and to promote and to support through different mechanisms, funding and institutional mechanisms to support good journalism and good journalists to do their work, to provide options, to make sure that people go outside their silos, so they're not confined in a particular news network, but they can see beyond that silos and see other versions of the events that they're being covered. Otherwise, we will continue with the process of polarization that you're living in the United States. I mean, I'm originally from Venezuela. I was born in Venezuela, raised and worked there. And of course, polarization is what have lead us in Venezuela where we are now. So I think we have to work in different fronts to confront this problem.
Mm-hmm. So allow me perhaps to follow up with, you know, what might be the answer may be self-evident, which but the question is, what makes good journalism? So what are the criteria that we as avid readers, viewers, or what have you, what might be some elements of judgments we can use to determine this is good journalism versus this other thing that is not even journalism. It might be infotainment, entertainment, lies, or what have you.
Sandra.
Basically, it must be first of all, if you have a history, you know that journalist or that particular media outlet has a history of being there. It's as opposed to something that just come out on social media or on YouTube, just to give you an example. That would be one thing. The second would be the persons that are involved, the individuals that are covering the stories. Are they providing more than one point of view, and are they providing documents and evidence? Are they allowing at least more than one version to come out? Or is it only one-sided, the story? That can give you an idea. And also the trajectory. Also, you can find out in the history of each particular story, in the composition of the actual reporting or stories. You'll find out if it's a real journalism or infotainment. But I have to say that sometimes the lines are blurring, and quite recently, particularly on electronic media, just this weekend here in Puerto Rico, with the unfortunately death of women in domestic violence and abuse cases, I basically pointed out that I saw traditional news outlets performing as infotainment news outlets, and you would see gossip and infotainment news shows sometimes covering more than one angle that are supposed to be done by regular reporters. So lines are blurring. I'm afraid that is also happening. So it's making a little bit difficult for the people to understand. And if you add to that the situation that now political analysts are becoming more and more available in all the media, so people get confused. So I do stress what Federico and Jairo mentioned, the need for more media literacy education, and the need for schools and universities to help in educating the society in that regard.
Thank you. Jairo, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sandra. I wanted to concentrate not so much in what makes good journalism, to what makes good journalists. And I think that what makes good journalists is individuals who don't necessarily think they have the whole truth, and who are open-minded and consider other options, and most important, are able and capable to say either I don't know or I was wrong. And I think that's a thing that it's a fundamental characteristic of good journalists, that people who are willing to admit that they're wrong, that they don't know enough, and willing to go. And they used to be the case, but now a lot of journalists get so invested in their own political position that they are unable or unwilling to say those things. I don't know, or I don't know enough, or I was wrong. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is good journalists need to understand that the facts are the facts, but that the facts can be interpreted in many different ways. And so to have an open mind, to be able to say, it might be that I'm not getting the whole picture, and then these facts might have other interpretation in another scenario or in another context. And that's, I think it's an important second characteristic. And the third characteristic, and I think it's also very important in the context of Puerto Rico, is that journalists cannot only be happy or satisfied to expose the truth. You know, the U.S. objectivity school have told the global South for many years that journalism is about objectivity, which I'm very critical for many reasons, and it will take another conference just to discuss that. But good journalist for me is not only somebody who is satisfied with the facts, with the objective facts, but also with the pursuit of justice, of social justice. Good journalism is about not only exposing the truth, but using the truth as a means to achieve the greater goods of society. And I think that's something that we are missing at the moment, that third element of that compromise with social justice is simply not there. And you can see this in a lot of the coverage, some of them quite good of journalists, but that only stops in the denunciation of the problem, but not in the interpretation and the presentation of potential solutions for society. And I think that's where journalism is falling short.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Federico, you wanted to add?
I tell my students to check 3 questions. If the journalist is telling you who's making the decisions, by which means are the decisions being made? Is it open? Is it closed? Is it centralized? Whatever. And number three, if the story tells us who's benefiting or who is not benefiting from those decisions, whatever those may be. I think that when we get a full story of who clearly stating who's behind the decisions, how the decisions have been made, and who is benefiting and who is not benefiting, we get a better story from journalists.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. I want to remind members of the audience that if they want to ask questions, to please use the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. We'll be using the Q&A function, not so much the chat, but the Q&A function to field questions that may be from the audience. So we're going to continue with the conversation, but I want to give you the opportunity to continue with your remarks.
First things that I'd like to point out is that it is fundamental to understand the factors that contribute to Puerto Rico's colonial media setting. Number one is that it is part of a capitalist system that is geared to maximize the profits of the owners of those media, except for the few public media. And those are not working as they should, as we'd like them to. But the purpose of those media is to maximize the profits for the owners. It's not, I mean, of course, they have a public service interest, because if they serve the public, they get more advertisers and then they make more money. But it's not that they're going to go out of their way to do things that would not maximize their profits. So the second point is that the media in Puerto Rico work under the US Constitution and the US government regulations from the Federal Communications Commission and all of the other regulatory factors. So even if Puerto Rico regulates some of its media institutions in some form or fashion, it is subject to the federal, the US, the colonial masters' point of view of how those media can and cannot operate. One positive part of that is the First Amendment for the freedom of speech, which has allowed for fewer restrictions that otherwise the colonial internal government of Puerto Rico would have imposed, like the La Ley de la Mordaza, that was unconstitutional from the beginning, but it took years to get rid of it. But that's part of the structure of how those media operate. A third point to point out about how the media in Puerto Rico operate is that from the beginning, even before Puerto Rico was a colony of the United States, it was a colony of Spain, it was working in struggles for independence. And I say that there's developments regarding the struggle for independence that always undermine some of the operations, because one of the factors that contributes to the way the media operate and the journalists can operate is that there is the maximum efforts to suppress the independence points of views and independence media, and they could be different forms. We address that, and we have documented how that has happened across the island. Now, other factors that contribute to how the media operate in Puerto Rico are the education system, where everybody has to learn English from grade school all the way to second year in college. So it allows for Puerto Ricanos to be more in tune to US media, from those foreign media, US media that are in Puerto Rico, and they're with all of the cable and everything else. So Puerto Ricanos, compared to other groups in Latin America, may be more attuned to English language media that's pervasive in Puerto Rico. So that contributes to the dynamic of how the island operates. Two other factors that we don't address because they are not analyzed, we don't find the research for them as much as we'd like to, is that the impact of the ultra-conservative Cuban exile community had in the structure and how the media developed after the 1960s, of who were the owners, who were the advertisers, how the media system itself emerged, and how that impacted these struggles for independence as well in Puerto Rico. So that's something that we'd like to see explored, as well as the religious institutions, how the religious institutions have had an impact. Now, if there's one thing that we're going to address about what the journalists told us, and it's another factor that contributes to how the media operate, is what I call the amenable government media relations. And that is the palsy-walsy. There are different ways of saying it, but it's such a merging of how journalists and the media and the government and government officials operate sometimes hand to hand, that we could say that so much of the journalism is not advocacy for truth of what's happening with the corruption of government, as much as just that's the way things are, that's the way things work, and they're very much intertwined. And this is something that Sandra has been exposing for many years. Yeah. And we hope that she will continue to do so. Sandra.
I don't know if I will have the stamina or the energy to keep on doing that, because it's really hard. And I have to be honest, because exposing what's going on in the media, and not because of the corruption within the government and also in the media, but also the fact that it affects the freedom of the expression and the right of the people to get to know what's going on its government and on its politics and on the general economy. And as Federico mentioned, in the past few years, you have seen sort of a marriage between sectors of the media, particularly journalists, who have worked as government officials and then go back, work as journalists. I myself, I can give you an example. I have a license to be a public relations professional, which I have been in the past, but it's hard. I mean, and it's not ethical. It's unethical to combine both jobs at the same time. You cannot be a public official and at the same time become a journalist asking for the government what's going on. And you see that happening in Puerto Rico in a way, because of the jobs and the scarcity of the jobs and the low payments and the reductions and the shortages in the media news groups. I mean, all of the media have basically shut down some of their operations, and they have laid off many reporters because of the economy. But at the same time, you see not only that aspect, but also you see a lot of pundits and talking heads, particularly on electronic media, they happen to be all of them lobbyists, government lobbyists. Basically, I will say 70 to 80% of them are attorneys, and
cabilderos, lobbyists, cabilderos, and you can't tell if they're what they do, but that's they're selling the government or the point of view of the government.
And it's important to mention that some of those lobbyists and cabilderos they used to be former government officials. Some of them were involved in the chat of Telegram. Some are basically taking over the jobs of journalists, and people get confused. They think there are reporters. And I will also like to add particularly that I have basically counted them on my articles. I will say that only less than 28% of them are women, and basically 2 are only people of color. So it's a particular class, a particular race, and white male-dominated upper class in Puerto Rico, which also turns to see the world in one particular area, and that's the message that is getting across. And unfortunately, that's how the media is operating in Puerto Rico. Very superficial. Most of the reporters that are doing investigative reports are being forced to do it on their own, work as independent journalists. And the media, that is happening elsewhere. It's particularly happening a lot in Latin America and Central America. But you have seen, you can tell, and we include some of that in the book, and in the upcoming Spanish version, we have to include that, the fact that it has grown exponentially in the past 2 years in Puerto Rico. So that's part of what's going on. And also, and I do have to stress that this book, which is something different from what you see, the way the perspective that some of us see living on the island and experiencing this, the fact that we have Federico in the States and also in Europe, we have Jairo elsewhere in Europe and in Qatar, it also provides a different perspective, a more ample view of what's going on in the world. And I do think that helps in the in framing also and understanding the narratives and understanding how the settings of colonialism affect journalism and what people receive through their media. So I do think that's very important in this book.
So Jairo, indeed, we have a colonial setting in Puerto Rico, but it's not unique to Puerto Rico, yet the way the media operate are intertwined with the colonial framework that you discuss.
Absolutely, and even after countries have stopped being colonies, they keep many of the settings and many of the institutional forms that the colonial power left. And we see that, we always complain, for example, about countries like Zimbabwe having very restrictive laws. And even here in Qatar, where you have very restrictive law, and we tend to blame them in Sharia law and Islam, but actually many of the most restrictive law here in Qatar were developed by the British when they were a colonial power here. They say, you see in Hong Kong, for example, now with all that's taking place, the laws that the Hong Kong authorities are using to persecute journalists are not the laws from the Chinese, are the laws that were left by the British. Hong Kong never had a election until 2 years before they handed over to China. So, this idea that the colonial era was a liberal era, that they brought liberal values, that's not true. Historical or factually is untrue. And the same can say, to many colonies. I however want to emphasize in two very positive aspects of the book that I think also makes to the contrary. So one is that we really provide, for the first time, I think, for the research we did, it's to me was very clear that it's the first time that somebody actually is tackling the political economy of the media system in Puerto Rico. It's the first time that we really saw the interlink between media ownership, colonialism, and media structures and power in Puerto Rico. And I think that's it's a very positive contribution, because then you can start doing something about it. The other area that I think is very positive and that provides a space for intervention and improvement is journalism education. And I think one of the most beautiful parts of the book is when we talk about journalism education and what can be done in relation to journalism education, because the people graduating from journalism schools who will be working in Puerto Rico are going to find a very different media landscape, a profoundly different, profoundly fragmented in terms of audiences, but profoundly different in terms of the structures, with challenges, but also with opportunities. And I think the particular contribution that we make in the sections on journalism education opens a lot of possibilities for action and for organization on the ground.
I know precisely that's a good segue, because for pointing out some of the findings, we don't have enough time to go into all of the findings from the journalists, because there were 9 questions. We asked 11 questions. 9 of them are discussed and summarized from the point of view of the journalists in the book. We won't go into the crisis and how they see the crisis, how they see the journalists themselves see their role. But I can highlight one point before going into the journalism education, and one other point about journalism education that will be valuable for all of us. Number one is that in spite of all the problems that they pointed out, more than half of the people we interviewed saw themselves in some journalism role in their future. They weren't saying, I'm about to give up, I'm ready to leave. They see themselves working as journalists, be it for a company that they work for or on their own, which takes us to one of the goals of the journalism education that they pointed out, is that there's a need for entrepreneurship, teaching and learning in journalism, so that it's not just how to write the correct sentence and how to use the technology, but they want, the journalists were suggesting that we develop an entrepreneurial process for that. And the other highlight in the journalism education was to the question of news and media literacy. 59 of the 60 respondents said yes, there should be news and media literacy for overcoming the challenges of journalism. I don't know why that one person said no, but that was just the word no. But the other 59, some of them wrote short paragraphs on the value and how to proceed with that. So the book deals with that. And then we will leave it to the reader to see all the suggestions for future research, from the political communication, from the cyberbullying to everything else that we recommend that is not being taught at the journalism and it's not being emphasized in the journalism and communication schools. But we hope this book serves as an incentive with those and other questions to proceed and enhance the field of understanding the media system and the media and journalism in colonial settings and in times of crisis in Puerto Rico. We now open it to another round of questions from the public. We'll be glad to answer them as they come along. Thank you again for being part of this webinar today.
Thank you again, Sandra, Federico, Jairo. We have definitely been fielding questions as they have been coming in. So, so far we have had about, 15, 16 questions. And, one that remains that was just posted is, will the journalists that you interviewed or that, submitted responses to the questions you gave them, will those interviews be made available to the public?
Only the summary in the book. Probably the longest chapters of the book are my condensing the points of views, gathering them in by topic and by subtopics, and presenting the highlights, the common points of views, and then the divergent points of views in the answers to the particular question. But the tape recordings and the emails that I gathered from that, I told all of the journalists that I would keep them anonymous unless they allowed me to say so, their name. And I didn't follow up and asking, well, this is what I'm going to quote. Can I use your name? I didn't do that. So I just have a number to identify for my own records who said what.
And you took care of laying out a methodological approach to the questions. I mean, you disclose how it was that you approach. You emphasize that it is a, you call it a convenience sample. It is almost more like a snowball sample, which is nevertheless a convenience sample. But you also took care. I don't know if you submitted it to the human research subject.
Well, wait, Jairo, just a second. I'm not working for any university. No. So I don't have to do that.
This research actually, we follow in that case because the research happened when Federico was a visiting professor of the University of Leeds. So we followed the protocol set up by the Art and Humanities Research Council in Great Britain, and which actually requires the anonymization of the subjects of an interview as a precondition to carry out this type of research. And even in some cases, the HRC requires that even when some of the individuals allow for the disclosures of their names, we're still bounded to keep the anonymity because to protect them, even when they, in case it. So as I said, this is research that was made possible by the Leverhulme Trust in Britain. And well, basically, that's why I allow Federico, Sandra, and I to get together and work for a whole year there. So yes, I mean, we did follow that, but most of the data is there, and we picked up the most interesting part. We probably have some material left to do other type of work in the future. Definitely some additional material will go in the Spanish version, but let's see what is in addition to that.
And
No,
I like to add something there, Carlos, that also when we were doing the sample for the interviews, we make sure that we included in the sample a fair amount of female journalists versus male, also younger journalists, reporters that are not working on the San Juan metropolitan area, but other regions within the island. Also, former journalists or journalists that are retired, television reporters, online reporters, digital media reporters, radio reporters. So we had from all across the media scene and the ecosystem of the media in Puerto Rico, we have a representation. So we're fairly happy with the amount of interviews that we had. As a matter of fact, I told Federico, and I think I told Jairo before, but I do believe that segment alone, that part alone, could be a whole book together with their answers.
Yes, yes. No, there's no question about.
If I can add one more thing, if I may.
Yes.
When we set out to do what Jairo told me, indeed, as he mentioned previously, go and interview the top journalists, 10 o 12, entrevístate a 10 o 12, see their points of views. And we were going to select those top people who were most recognized. And we had a snowball sample. Who do you think is most? So we followed that. Now, it's not a representative sample in the traditional social science that we have every seventh respondent on a list. And then we have we couldn't do that. There's no way we could have done that and have done the work that we did. But believe me, the people who answered are very well known in Puerto Rico. They are influential. I'm not going to tell you their names, but if you were to trust us as our source, as your source, if you're going to trust us as scholars and our serious take on that, the names of the people who responded are very well known and their views are very well respected in their journalism work. So we're just representing that, summarizing that in the book.
Yeah. No, and let me tell you something. It shows. It shows that you took care of adhering to established human subject protection protocols. You took great care of describing that in the book. Sandra, absolutely right. I think I noticed that 60% of respondents were female. So, even though you cannot state that it is a representative sample of the journalists on the island, it's not a limited sample. It includes many voices, right? And as a social scientist who pines for conducting surveys in Puerto Rico, I can sympathize with how difficult and costly it is. So, perhaps we can devise ways in which, we can promote, since that is one of the items in the agenda for future research, to engage in more survey research in Puerto Rico. Another question that remains unanswered says, and it's addressing, is directed to Jairo, and the member of the audience asks that you restate how you said Puerto Rican colonialism is viewed in Europe. You said that they say, well, that's because, why do they not see colonialism in Puerto Rico as a serious issue?
Yeah, I mean, Europeans obviously have a blind spot for colonies. It doesn't register in their mind something that is colony after being 200 years colonizing the rest of the world. But it's interesting because first, there's very little information among most citizens about the Puerto Rican status. They always hear in the news, in the BBC or in AFP, they often hear, Estado Libre Asociado as a status, but then people don't know what is that. People don't know the limitations, the restrictions that Puerto Ricans have in terms of political participation. They don't know, they don't understand. There's a junta controlling almost every set of policy in the island and defining those things. So there is very little information in other parts of the world on Puerto Rico. And that's something that I think is very important to point out, that Puerto Rico doesn't have really an international voice. I mean, Puerto Rico doesn't have a comprehensive and effective network that allow it to project its own cause. Whatever the Puerto Ricans decide to do with their future, they're unable to project, and therefore there's little pressures towards the United States to address the Puerto Rican issue, because while other countries, like we're seeing it, there's a whole campaign at the moment trying to pressure Israel for the horrible occupation of the territories in Israel. And there was a whole campaign against South Africa, against apartheid. And there's nothing really pressuring internationally the United States to address the Puerto Rican question. And I think that's part of the reason, is that the Puerto Rico doesn't have a structured voice that goes international. And there's very little knowledge and understanding about the Puerto Rican issue abroad. And I think that's one of the big tasks that Puerto Ricans have to do. They have to organize networks and promote networks that allows them to project all over the world their cause and the things that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things that I found in the book is the pressures that journalists themselves endure, or yourselves endure, in the practice of journalism in Puerto Rico. And one of the members of the audience says that, I thought it was government and all its press conferences that were limiting the role of journalism. Who has time to investigate for investigative journalism in such an atmosphere? And it makes me wonder, the description that in great detail that you go into on how there is such a demand for speed to churn out news stories without necessarily a time for journalists to really think seriously and in depth about the storylines they need to develop and they could develop, because there is this constant pressure to be ahead of the news curve, the news wave, right? So, yeah, and it makes me wonder also, for instance, how oftentimes journalists resort to ready-made press advisories and press releases to write the storylines, and how that contributes also to that perhaps amenable media, or that amenable relationship that may exist. Can you comment a little bit about, how, in terms of the responses to the survey, how those pressures that journalists face to, engage in their profession affect the outcome of the stories that they write?
Sandra.
Okay, I would like to basically say many things that just come up in my mind, not only because of the research done for the book, but also working on a daily basis and seeing and watching what is going on in Puerto Rico. And I just mentioned before the fact that there has been an influx of political analysts and lobbyists taking over spaces, particularly on television and on radio, on the main radio networks on the island. This January, I counted over 80 people basically covering spaces on a daily basis, providing their input or their issues and creating the agendas that they want to create into news stories. And reporters end up following up on what the politicians and former political allies or political representatives are saying as analysts or as media commentators or pundits. So that's one thing. The second, and it goes along, is the fact that most of the media landscape has changed dramatically because of the reduction and the shortage of personnel. All of the media, the big media corporations have laid off reporters. And you see that in newspapers, for instance, they don't have the traditional editors or the copy editors. Those departments are basically gone. And sometimes reporters end up doing basically everything, covering for social media, tweeting, writing for the paper, taking the pictures, filming a video, doing everything at the same time. For only one reporter. That's happening elsewhere, but in Puerto Rico, you tend to see it more and more. And also there's a new trend of having more younger reporters basically running everything, and you don't have a layer of seasoned veteran journalists that used in the past to serve as basically as the editors or as the reference. And there's a tendency to
or as the institutional history.
Exactly, the institutional history. That's true. And sometimes, and adding to that, the fact that sometimes if you have this saying, and I have heard it many times also in the newsrooms on the island, that if you don't find it on Google, it never happened. That's an attitude that some younger reporters are having, unfortunately, and it's really bad because they don't have a historical context on issues that are repeating in our history. So that's one thing. And then the other aspect, which is really, really worrisome, is the how it's going to be funded, how media can be able to operate within this landscape. You have all the advertisers have shrunk and cut their advertising dollar, their expenditures on the media. That's happening elsewhere, even before the pandemic. Now it's even worse. But then on the other hand, non-traditional media or independent journalists it's every day it's harder for us to be able to keep on doing what we try to do. So that's in the near future, and also I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for the profession on the island and for the diversity of information and viewpoints for the general public.
There's 2 points that I must add to this part of the discussion. Number one is indeed the alternative media are finding it harder, and even the traditional media are finding it harder to survive because of the economic crisis, that all media, practically all media, depend on some revenues from advertisers. Now, one of the biggest advertisers for Times and Being has been government. Okay, so government tells a journalist or a news media, a traditional news media operator, we have $100,000 budget to promote X or Y agency. Let's get some favorable stories about X or Y agency, and we'll put a lot of advertising dollars in your media outlet. That means that the other part of the critical problem with journalism in Puerto Rico and many other places of the world is that the contracts for services, los contratos de servicio, the contracts for construction, the contracts for everything else are not transparent, and they're going to their friends in government, in legal industry, in advertising, you name it, and there's no scrutiny of the quality of the work that's being done. And if it's just payoff for silencing the corruption or for silencing the mismanagement, the people who are causing a lot of the economic and infrastructure problems in Puerto Rico are there because they are political appointees, not because of their knowledge or skills to hold those positions. And they're there because they're there to gather money for the political party and make sure that the media don't report on the crisis that happens under their supervision. So that's part of the amenable relationship between media and journalism that should be broken. And the only people that might be doing that most effectively might be the alternative journalists and media who work regardless of having those multi-million-dollar advertising contracts.
As part of, and I don't know if Jairo, go ahead. You had a point.
Carlos, just to add something to this, because in the book we mentioned that part of the forces that has shaped the structure and the nature of the media in Puerto Rico, of course, has been the colonial status of the island. But the other force, which is equally strong in shaping, has been globalization. And one of the aspects that both Sandra and Federico are mentioning is what is happening with the political economy of the media. And what is happening is that the political economy of the media is reflecting the wider political economy of society. You know, it's very easy to finger point internet for the disappearance of newspapers, and some people have rushed into saying, "Oh, it's the new technologies that got the newspapers away." I don't agree with that. What I think that has happened is that we have witnessed a concentration of ownership. You know, in the tourist part of Puerto Rico in the past 2 years, there's something like 10,000 jobs lost in that same area, and we're seeing an increasing concentration of business. We're seeing big Amazon dominating the whole commerce. We're seeing particular companies, Walmart, getting away with the local industry. So those people who used to advertise in the local newspapers, which were the independent local companies, family-owned companies or independent companies who used to advertise in the local media, they're no longer there, because now it's a big corporation. That big corporation that controls all the commerce is now only advertised selectively in particular national media. And in the case of Puerto Rico, this is even more severe, given the fact that a lot of the companies that operate in Puerto Rico are owned by U.S. are subsidiaries of U.S. companies. So nobody in Puerto Rico decides about budget. Very few people that can actually allocate advertising, independent advertising to that. And then, of course, the other thing is you have a tradition in the U.S. that you think that a government should not give directly money to the media because otherwise it compromises the independence of the media. But guess what? You're doing it through the worst way possible, which is advertising, instead of creating pots of funding to support independent, like the Europeans do with the BBC, or Norway, for example, have a fund to money and dedicates money, which is transparent, looked by the parliament, to allocate money to local newspapers. And guess what? Norway is the country, one of the countries in the world that in which there's still a high level of independence within the media ownership structures. So I think we are talking about a wider problem here of globalization, of concentration of capital, and what Schumpeter called the destructive creative process of capitalism that concentrates ownership to a point that it makes the industry non-viable.
It's interesting because one of the questions in the Q&A comes, it says, I work for the San Juan Star, itself a product of colonial thinking. It is not defunct. The parent company, Scripps Howard, sent many Anglo-stateside to run the paper. The learning curve was steep. So, that question or that comment speaks to both the point that you have just made, Jairo, but it also speaks to the fact that because many of these companies are defunct, because a lot of the input that comes in as a result of this editor, comes from, it has a broader perspective. I wonder if that is also what has contributed to the proliferation of much more localized news gathering and news outlets in Puerto Rico, which is also something that you document in the book.
Before I let Sandra and Federico answer that question, which are the better place, I just wanted to point out something that you mentioned, about like local newspaper versus nationally owned paper. A newspaper like Star, when a newspaper is family owned or independently owned, if they make 5, 7, 8% profit, that's an excellent profit for a newspaper. But when you're owned by a big corporation, 14, 15, 20% of profit is not enough, because you have to pay that to thousands of shareholders. So that's another pressure that has distorted the media. When Bill Clinton in the 1990s changed the federal FCC law, Federal Commission laws that allow concentration of capital, and then we had this cannibalization of big media cannibalizing small media, and that all through the 1990s and 2000s. That's what we're living now. Is the result of that deregulation, that process of deregulation that we had early. So we're living the consequences of bad policies. Sorry, Federico and Sandra, I'll let you answer that.
You're absolutely correct, and the deregulation in the United States, which inevitably affects Puerto Rico, has led for Puerto Rico to have from at one point, and this is something that Luis Rosario Albert has studied extensively, much more than I have or Sandra or anybody else, is the process of how the cable companies in Puerto Rico were multiple companies at one point, and now it's just one major monopoly. Why? Because of the globalization, the deregulation, and even if Puerto Rico policymakers would have said, we need more than just one monopoly provider for all of Puerto Rico, because this one is lousy or doesn't give us enough perspectives, it's nothing could be done in Puerto Rico about that because of the power of the Federal Communication Commission and the external decision makers in the corporate world. But Puerto Rico deserves more than one just Liberty Cable Company. It deserves options to receive many channels from Latin America and other parts of the world, but it doesn't have the power to do so.
Also, I'd like to add that there's a trend also with the way some of these media companies behave, and you see them as corporate companies and the corporate perspective in Latin America. Companies that operate in places like Mexico, for example, and how they own telecommunications companies and also media companies there. They're moving into doing some sort of that in Puerto Rico in a way that there are companies, just to give you an example, that operate telecommunications business here under the FCC and under the law, but even though they have not controlled the media, they're doing it indirectly through advertising. So they have their own, just to give you an example, Claro, the Mexican telecommunications giant, they have their own digital newsroom in one of the top AM stations, WKAQ, from former Univision, or it still remains Univision. It's being sold right now, or it's been on sale. So that's just an example how they can influence what is being communicated to the public, and how some stories are not being out and are not being communicated. Just to give you an example, and using that single company, there's a class action lawsuit against that company. It was not covered by any media outlet because they did a press conference saying that they were launching a cell phone on using the 5G technology. And if you wonder why, that story that will probably represent that the company it's going to be ordered to pay about $500 million back to consumers, was not newsworthy for the newspapers or to the radio stations to cover it. Basically, the fact that they pay advertising, and that's, the media are going to be more enthusiastic or tune into following up what their advertiser wants them to publish. So that's an example, a current example that that happened just a couple of months ago, and that happens all the time.
Another question that has come up in the chat, in the Q&A, and it is something that you leave as one of the areas for future research, is the role of the diaspora, Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico, and how they may be engaged, involved, affect the media landscape in Puerto Rico, or of Puerto Ricans. And there are two questions that have already been answered, but I think it would be nice to perhaps bring it out as to address the topic of the diaspora. One says, will U.S. national media preempt Puerto Rico's local journalism when it comes to informing the Puerto Rican diaspora? So this is, for instance, the New York Times or the Washington Post or CBS or whomever going down to Puerto Rico, informing Puerto Ricans in the United States about what is going on in Puerto Rico, as opposed to how Puerto Rican local media may inform Puerto Ricans in the United States about the goings-on in Puerto Rico. And that has some serious political implications, given the fact that since the majority of people who identify as Puerto Rican no longer live in Puerto Rico, but they live in the United States, and therefore they may influence policy and politics in Congress or in the administration. It's interesting also how US media outlets will be another player in how things, in how news stories are developed affecting Puerto Rico.
And I'd like to hear from Sandra, and then I have something to share about that.
That has happened in the past, but I must say that we have seen an increase in that particular aspect of competing journalists from the States and media outlets from the States right after Hurricane Maria. Mm-hmm. And when I said that happened in the past, there was US-based media companies and organizations like UPI, Associated Press had a big operation in Puerto Rico. Basically 1 or 2 people now, is really small compared to 10 or 15 years ago, and other news outlets. But right after Hurricane Maria, we experienced an influx of many mainland and international news outlets that came to the island. And when the former Governor Rosselló held the press conference at the first ones, he would do them in English, and he will answer questions from the stateside media and basically control the opportunities for local reporters to make questions. And some of them were not allowed to go inside the news area to basically ask questions because some of the news outlets were not operating and they were not out, or they were off the air. That was one of the main situations that happened right after Hurricane Maria. Then during the summer and with all the other issues that have affected us, particularly I would say the financial aspects, there have been some news organizations that are getting the stories before local stories, the local media. I would just think about particularly media such as Bondholder or Business Insider, or even the Financial Times are getting stories before the local El Nuevo Dia or El Vocero newspapers, mm-hmm. because they're handling and having the information even within the state from the Junta de Control Fiscal and the financial aspects. And then during the later emergencies that we've had, there has been so many other reporters coming in from the States. I will say my dear friend, David Begnut, it's one of them that is basically covering the story for the States. And he also has social media, and he tends to cover basically on a daily basis issues from Puerto Rico. People call them. And during the summer of 2019, he was instrumental in getting mm-hmm. across the story out there of what mm-hmm. we were doing locally. So he helped us in expanding the importance and providing information for not only the diaspora, but also for the U.S. mainland audiences, the general audiences, but also in keeping abreast of the information. Right now, some of the local reporters are getting upset because sometimes he gets information before us, before the local reporters. Mm-hmm. Politicians tend to call him or other outside media first. So that's a challenge that we will be increasing in the new upcoming years. And as a way to oppose that, you'll see some local news outlets beginning to form alliances with stateside companies.
Mm-hmm. Federico?
Sandra has laid it out so clearly, and that's why she is so knowledgeable. I mean, because she is so knowledgeable, she can lay it out so clearly what's going on in those media operations. One part of the equation is, in fact, that the local journalists are subject to the restrictions, censorship, limitations imposed by the managers of their media outlets, who are themselves considering anything that they're going to publish that doesn't touch the toes too much on the advertisers, government, or otherwise. Mm-hmm. So that mm-hmm. dynamic takes place at the local level. It doesn't affect at all any of the journalists who from the United States go to Puerto Rico to write those few stories that they do write, and it's not as much as they could and they should. But they don't have those restrictions. They don't have to say, well, if I start writing the story, I might lose my job, or I might get demoted, or I might be put on the writing the dog shows instead of writing about the circus that goes on in the capital city or the Capitolio or other like that. So, and then for the local politicians, they don't like the few outstanding critical journalists like Sandra. They'll avoid them like the plague because they're going to ask the critical questions. So no, we're not going to tell them. We'll tell those outsiders what we think they should know. Those outsiders many times won't know the in-depth of it, so they'll take whatever we tell them and that's enough. They won't do the digging and the critical thinking. So that's how they safeguard their processes. And all of that is going on a regular dynamic every day. And one way to help the Puerto Rican diaspora get a better point of view of what's happening in Puerto Rico is one of the things that you pointed out in my bio under in the original presentation. I'm one of a team of people who's trying to get funding to launch what's going to be Boricua Media Connections, multi-platform news, and mostly information, cultural and otherwise, but certainly including news for the Puerto Rican diaspora in main cities. And it's a partnership with 2 public radio stations in Florida. Then it may be many more. And we want to have a connection with the public media in Puerto Rico and alternative media in Puerto Rico to present the diaspora in the United States, not just the corporate points of views, but a broader perspective on culture, information, and also help the Puerto Rican diaspora be better prepared in cases of emergencies, so it doesn't depend on traditional English language media that won't cover the issue, or the Puerto Rican media that will be covering just what they can at the local level. So that is a work in process. If we get the funding, you'll be hearing about it in the next few months.
Thank you. To begin to wrap up the discussion, I want to perhaps emphasize the fact that in this discussion, we have spent quite a bit of time talking about particularly the political economy of the news media in Puerto Rico and how journalists have been affected by the setup, the political economic setup of the media landscape in Puerto Rico. But in the book, you pay as much, in fact, you pay much more emphasis to another system of domination. You know, you pay quite a bit of emphasis to colonialism. And, you know, even though we're all subject to, you know, various systems of domination, certainly in Puerto Rico, you have colonialism, you have sexism, you have racism, you have extractive economic regimes, and oftentimes all of them at once. In this book, you home in and dive deeply on the effect that the Puerto Rico's colonial subjection affects its news media. And you state that the news media forms part of an apparatus of hegemonic reinforcement, right? And you do a terrific job in showing how the present colonial status of Puerto Rico structures conditions in Puerto Rico's media landscape. But my question for you all is, would these conditions change much or at all under another status? In other words, how does the media in a colony differ from the media in an independent state in the global South, such as anywhere in the circum-Caribbean, or in relation to states in the United States?
I don't.
Well, yeah, I was yes. Now, I think that undoubtedly the change of the context, the change of the status of Puerto Rico will mean a lot for Puerto Rico, because it means that Puerto Rico, to start with, will have its own agenda. And having its own political agenda means that you will have a different news agenda. And that means that you will have to it will provide more plurality by de facto, because there will be different actors within the confined space of Puerto Rico making decisions. I don't know what the Puerto Ricans will decide at the end. It's up to the Puerto Ricans to decide, and not to me to tell them what to do or how to do it. But what I can say
on the United States, I'm sorry.
Huh?
It might also depend on the United States.
Yeah. But I mean, my view is that what is untenable from an outsider is the current status. That's what it cannot continue, and the change of that status will profoundly change the political structures and the institutions. Now, journalism is a political institution.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to recognize that. And the media are organizations, but journalists as a whole, as a body, is an interpretative community that in itself, it's a political institution. If the context that shapes the political institution changes, then the political institution of journalism will have to change too. We'll have to engage with society in a very different way. So I'm absolutely convinced that a change in status of Puerto Rico will mean a reshaping and a restructure of the media in Puerto Rico, of journalism as a political institution in Puerto Rico. Now, will that change be for the better? Well, it will depend on Puerto Ricans and depend on the ability of the Puerto Ricans to organize themselves. For example, one of the questions I was answering in the Q&A thing, somebody was asking me, how did they see the future of journalism? And I always say that the future of journalism will be in the future will be as much as dissemination as it was in the past, as it is networking and organization and advocacy. And I think that's something that we will have to see in a new Puerto Rico. We will have to see a different type of practicing journalism in ways that adapt to the new situation of Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Sandra has something to share with us about what she sees. Crystal ball. She has the crystal ball. Every January, she writes one of the columns of las proyecciones of the media in the future, and she could tell about this. But here's one thing to keep in mind. All media are reflections of the political and the economic institutions in the country in which they work. Mm-hmm. So whatever status Puerto Rico has, independent, hopefully never state, or worse yet, the continuation of the status quo, will be reflecting the political and the economic struggles of who is in control of the economic resources, of the decision-making process, and the media will be in the process of reflecting that, debating that, gaining some power in that. It's all a dynamic that will continue. Now, who controls, who decides, will depend on a number of factors that I can't predict at this time, but I can predict that there will always be a struggle. The one struggle that would not be the case is the struggle for estadidad o independencias or status quo, because that would be over with. There'll be other struggles, but not the one for a vote for this or that or the other, because it'll be who's going to be who's going to be the presidente, or who's going to be the gobernador de los estados. I hope that's not the case again, but that struggle will always be there for who's going to control the millions of dollars from the taxpayers and from any other source that money comes in.
Well, if I may to add to what Federico and Jairo said, which I totally agree, I will have to say in two regards. First of all, in terms of the operations of the local media or the local media companies, you will see more transformation in the next couple of years. We're going to see, with the influx of federal funding and the CDBGR's fundings and the reconstruction and some other issues, we might see some changes within the media landscape. I would say many of the radio stations are going to disappear or are going to be transformed. Some of the newspapers basically are not publishing on print. They're basically going all in digital. So we're going to see some other situations in digital media. In television, we'll see more local programming, but for some periods of time, there's going to be some changes also within the media, the television landscape. But in terms of content on that media, we're going to keep on seeing the same, because there's such an influx of the advertisers and the government within what is the message and what is the news and what is what they're conveying, that is it's going to continue in the next couple of months. However, I'm optimistic because of what I'm seeing on digital and social media, and particularly with what some reporters are doing, creating their own media outlets and very niche oriented particular media, and with really good reporters are coming up. There's media for female-oriented journalism. We have also media directed towards particular areas of the population within, I would say, older population, LGBTQ communities. They're doing a good job, and they're doing also more of an advocacy and as well as informing some of the stories that are not coming out on the traditional media. And in the last part, I would say investigative reporting as well. And you'll see some examples and from what some people like Julio Víctor Ramírez y Mayagüez is doing, El Centro de Periodismo Investigativo is doing, even Jay Fonseca within his own television stations and his own media outlets is doing as well. So we are seeing some areas, and we're gonna see in the next couple of months new outlets coming out. And I myself, I'm working on some things that are coming out that we're planning to come out in the next couple of months within the regional, the Caribbean region, not only including local news, but also stories within the region, because we're seeing some news stories that are being not covered by the media. Just to give you an example, drug trafficking. Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, the whole Caribbean area is a 30% of all the drug that goes from South America to the US goes through Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic and the US Virgin Islands, and that is not really being covered by the local media. So you're going to be seeing some journalism in that way. So I'm pretty optimistic of what we're going to be seeing in the next couple of months and years.
Jairo, go ahead.
No, it's an excellent point that Sandra mentions, and leads me to think and to suggest that one of the things that Puerto Ricans perhaps might do is to look at what is happening and doing in other places. For example, in Scotland, where I used to live in Scotland, because they're looking for independence from the United Kingdom, there's been a national debate about what to do within the media, because they depend on the BBC public service broadcasters in London. And there are several proposals of what happens if Scotland becomes independent. How are we going to continue with the tradition of a public service broadcaster? I mean, at the moment, Puerto Rican taxpayers are paying a lot of money to the media through the advertising, which is allocated in ways that are not transparent, and they're not necessarily underpin independent journalism. So one of the discussions that should happen in Puerto Rico is, how are we going to allocate the resources that comes from the citizens to make sure that we have a media landscape that is plural and that reflects all the views? And to do that, you have to have a national debate. There has to be a national conversation, because this type of agreements can only happen if everybody's consulted and if everybody's on board in the need to have, you can take the opportunity to do something like the Europeans done, having a strong public service broadcasters, and detach yourself from the commercial tradition of the United States, still having, or having having independent fund to fund investigative journalism in private media, as you see in France and you see in other countries like Norway, as I mentioned. So, but it's a debate that has to happen. Puerto Ricans have to start talking about these issues, because the media, in any political change, the media is going to be central. And the worst thing that can happen is that Puerto Rico changes its status, but continues to have the same type of media as the same media structures that you have, because that has no future in my view. And you have to have that debate.
Okay. Jairo Lugo-Ocando, Sandra Rodríguez-Cotto, Federico Subervi-Vélez, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been a wonderful event and a terrific contribution to Puerto Rican studies, and I thank you for the effort.